So, thank you for being here today to talk about translanguaging. I think back, as I was getting ready for this discussion, I was thinking back to the very first international school that I taught at, where, and bear in mind this is probably nearly 20 years ago now, but students were actually told not to speak their mother tongue in the playground. And there was this consistent message of, you must speak English. And at that time it didn't really sit with me, but I hadn't delved into the research yet, or I didn't have the language to articulate why I wasn't willing to push kids to always speak English. And so it's exciting to think how far we've come. I'm sure the concept of translanguaging wasn't really around then, but what do we mean by translanguaging? Do you want to start, Juliette?
Shall I start? Yes, not a problem. So for me, the translanguaging is really the children being allowed, or anybody actually, any bilingual person, is able to access a new language by using the previous languages, the multiple languages that they have access to, as a bridge to basically learn the new language. And that way you really support the development of the understanding of these students rather than what they can say in the second language or the third language. What you also do as a school is you really welcome that whole child into a school. And for me that is a very personal experience. Having stopped speaking Dutch to my own son, he was exposed to 8 languages and he can only speak English now. So in the time where everybody believed that you should only speak English, it caused my own son to become a monolingual speaker. And so for me that really didn't sit well. And the other part I think also is, so you are welcoming that culture and you are welcoming the language, you're welcoming the whole child into that culture. And as a non-native English speaker myself, for the first time I also feel it validates who I am and what I bring to education itself, where before I was always very scared to actually say, well, I'm a non-native English speaker. So for me it is really welcoming that whole child into, and the whole teacher, into education.
Yeah, and seeing it as a strength.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Anyone want to add to that?
I was just say I really connect a lot to that. When I was in Iraq working with students in grade 2 in a school that the language of instruction was 2 foreign languages for the children. So they were learning 2 foreign languages and not their home language. That was prior to the introduction of the phrase or concept of translanguaging. So I, out of my own desire to honor their identity, began using their language for learning so that they could access and create new vocabulary and grow language. And later on I heard, what's this translanguaging thing? And who is this? Or Ophelia Cruz, I think. And I read it and I was like, I was doing that, you know. Yeah. Just like really affirming that I was doing the right thing because of the, we only speak Turkish here, we only speak English here. And I was like, but they're Kurdish, you know, and I don't want to replace their identity like you felt with your son. I felt I want to honor and value their identity and enrich it with other languages. But I wanted them to still be academic in their own home language and have that same vocabulary. If they learned it in English, they learned it in their own language. So I was trying to support that. But that's what it is for me. It's about their identity, their home language, and I don't want us to lose all these languages in the world that they're predicting that we'll lose.
You were honouring their home language, Kurdish, in this situation. Did you speak Kurdish?
No, I didn't speak anything. So there were moments that I was just watching.
And what was that? What was that like? Like,
it was just them talking with each other about what we just talked about. If I would have them turn and talk to their friend about the big theme we just talked about and the big idea, re-explain it, and then I would ask the provocative following question to get us to think deeper. And then I would get more participation, because they would reaffirm with themselves that they understood it, they would get a little bit more words, and then they could participate. But yeah, that was the process I was using, and then I realized it's a thing people are actually doing. So
yeah, that's amazing. So
can I actually add one thing to
Please.
that? Because it's really interesting that you said that. And I hear many teachers actually, when you start talking about translanguaging, they say to me, yes, secretly I was already doing that, but I wasn't allowed to do it. And so that in itself is just, people were scared, but they knew, everybody knew that you had to do this. And I think it's so good, even though you don't understand, at least the children understand, and that's the part that is far more important. It's their thinking that comes out. So,
and I think for me, historically, the concept of translanguaging actually comes from Wales, where back in the 80s, 90s, the students were in Welsh immersion. And in Scotland, I worked in Gaelic immersion. So, and at the very outset of it, it was actually two separate languages, and that distinction of when they would use one language and when they would use the other language in a kind of full immersion and then semi-immersive phase. So I think for me it's evolved again, because obviously through the lens 25 years ago in Scotland, I was using that first concept of translanguaging. And of course it's evolved now to be like one language practice, which is done where we are supporting and encouraging a child's linguistic repertoire in whatever languages they have. And I think that's the key. It is supporting that identity, and it's for us as practitioners finding ways that allow for that to happen while the students are under our care within the learning space.
Amazing. So how does translanguaging connect to a concept-based inquiry curriculum? What are the connections there?
I could just think back to Iraq and how much fun I had. We were putting the concepts all over the floor, but connecting to what they knew in their own language and what did they know there, and then thinking between those connections, where would they place them, how would they organize them. We kept concept maps on the wall. They could connect to their own pictures, the images that we used to make them real, but also through experiences, the learning experiences. I worked really hard to make the first 3 weeks, not just a one day of provocation, but like 3 solid weeks where we could generate vocabulary from that and connect it always back to the concepts. And that allowed them to transfer and then make connections across and learn things, expand. I just remember one time being in the library and one of my students going, "Miss Hargett, that's function," yelling across the library, and I was like, you did it. It was exciting, and it's just exciting. I think it's like that. It's honoring that, even the learning process, that we learn from concrete to pictorial to abstract. It's not just in maths. It's just what happens. That's how we learn. So language has to be concrete too. You have to make it accessible through an experience, and then name it.
I think naming it is very important. I also think as well it's being able to use, as you said, visuals, and also being able to ensure that the students have that permission. They know that they can communicate using their languages. So for me it's about getting a piece of text that has 2 or more languages within it, where they're not restricting their ideas by trying to only use the language of instruction, but that they are able to articulate their thoughts, articulate their ideas in whichever languages they want, in any flow that they wish it to go, so that actually we can then assess the learning too more efficiently and effectively.
What does that look like when it comes to forming a conceptual understanding or a generalisation, and in which language are students offered the opportunity to do that?
I think they could and should be offered to transfer that understanding in whichever language helps them to communicate that idea, because at the end of the day we have the resources within our schools to ask other community members or using online tools to translate these and to check how effective that is against what we had hoped they would do. So I think it's absolutely critical that they have that, and not only that, but have, when we are looking at mentor texts, that we are making translated mentor texts available for them, so they almost have a companion text where they're able to access it in both the language of instruction and their home language, so that they can make the connections across these and begin to participate more and integrate more with the learning of the classroom.
Yeah, Juliette, you were talking earlier today about this idea of having students write the generalisation in multiple.
Yeah, yes, and the thing is that I think is very important, as you were saying, it is going from that concrete to that abstract, where many times in the deductive teaching approach, they're going from abstract to concrete to abstract again. And because we are going from the concrete, that concrete thinking is happening at every level, and that's when you can start really developing the academic language proficiency that they will need. And because you start combining that, actually the learning of that second language or a third language speeds up, because you are tapping into all the thinking that they already have in place, and you're just putting labels on it. And so what you see is that the children pick it up, and through the concept-based inquiry cycle, the first parts are all factual. So through that factual development at a concrete level, all you're doing is the best EAL practice as well. Is basically putting labels on what they're thinking in one language, and then putting the label of the language of instruction. And as you're doing that, you're combining both. And then it is really important that both expressions are done in the multiple languages that children speak. And so that they can, particularly because academic language, they will not necessarily get from the home language anymore when it's just talking when they're having a dinner. Mm-hmm. That language isn't used. So it is important that both languages get that academic language proficiency.
I think that's a really good point, because I think certainly from experience you notice that students, when you do ask for some terms, once they've been in English instruction for a while, it's like, oh, I can't remember. Yeah. Oh, I don't know what that is. And again, it's at what age students come into English instruction is also very much, will affect the language they already have experience to in their home language, and whether they do school at a weekend or at other times within the home in their home language. So it is also for sure about that responsibility that we have as educators to, as well as give them a language of instruction, to try and preserve and also develop some of their home language as well, where it's possible to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you draw on the school community to support their languages?
I think that's also through a lot of parent education, because some parents have the misconception that the home language should be on the back burner because they might prioritize the language of instruction so they can achieve and make the high scores and do well and get into the university at the end. But I think through lots of parent education you can make them understand that the impact can be that their culture gets replaced, that they lose their home language, that we value their whole identity, and that we want to see the whole family included, that they don't leave something at the door when they come in. I'm just, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about our coming PYP exhibition, and how we can put some of that, make sure that manifests, in some of their displays or their actions, so that it's a lot more multilingual. Yeah.
We used to have also language buddies across the primary and the secondary school, and I think that can be so valuable because, for instance, we had one child in our primary school and nobody spoke his language, none of the TAs. Normally I hired different TAs with different languages, so that became a priority. But that particular child, there was only one other child in secondary, and that particular older child used to come to that child when he was playing outside, just to talk to him, because he knew, when we asked him, why are you doing this? This is your free time. And he went, I remember what it was like. And so I feel that I have to help this particular child to make him at ease with everything that is happening. And so to become a language buddy, so very quickly that child was much more at ease, because he knew that in the break time somebody would come, he would be able to talk his own language. They would talk about things that have been happening in class. He would help with translations of, you know, these are the rules in school, so you need to follow those as well. But later on, it really became a friendship, even though there was such an age difference. That was his language buddy, and don't you come close to him, because, you know, I'll protect him. And so I think it's that, again, that creation of a cultural connection again, not just a language, that really establishes the importance of using translanguaging, being there, being language buddies, having the variety of staff in languages in your school, and not just native English speakers.
But you know, that happened probably only because the school initially set up that connection of saying, hey, you two speak the same language. Can you? The older child maintained that connection, but the school had to first make them aware that this child existed in the primary school.
A good database is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and schools don't always have all of that information.
And we also use the in-school service. So the older students will come and link again as language buddies within the primary. And again, where maybe teachers are able to say what languages are spoken within the classroom, or which are the developing languages in terms of proficiency levels, so that they have somebody maybe once a week or twice a week that will come and work with them through translanguaging to develop their language skills.
Something we do to help all the teachers on the class list, it lists all the languages that are at home. So you can look at a student on the class list, you know, mother's home language, father's home language, and that's helpful. But it still sometimes hides things. You still don't always know that there's a third language, or there's something else. It's not the guarantee, but it's helpful.
What we do is, over the last few years, we have language profile meetings at the beginning of the school year, and that's really, really insightful.
With us other teachers or with students?
With the parents of the students that are coming into the school. So with the parents of the students that come in, and myself as a language acquisition teacher, but also the class teachers are invited, and I found them particularly valuable, because exactly what you're saying, Evelyn, sometimes we make assumptions when we see a form, but actually through dialogue with parents, and again going back to looking at what language they're using when, and some might be, you know, for 2 hours after school with grandma. So therefore then you begin to be aware of, okay, this is social language that they'll be using, or they're using a certain language but it's at sport at the end of a day. So it allows you to quickly as well see where social language and academic language may or may not be being used, and how it's evolved, and at what age or ages they've maybe had exposure to languages that they no longer use frequently now. So I found that very, very helpful practice.
Once students are more fluent in the language of instruction, what do we do to maintain these other languages in their language profile?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's a very important question, and I think it's possibly a question that we don't reflect on often enough, because I think as language proficiency does develop, we do want to ensure that we are maintaining and developing then concurrently the languages of the student. And I think what's also been is helpful as well is to maybe gain an understanding of, again, where they're using their languages, whether it's the host language, are they using that with the school, and also what are the parents' hopes for that language? What as a family are they wanting? What's their aspiration for the different languages their child has? And therefore, again, I think a partnership, if we have a better understanding of the parents' ambition for their child's different languages, it can help us to be partners with them to try and support these languages in whichever way we can within the school.
What do we do if parents only want their child speaking English?
I think, well, we have the opportunity when we're in another country where they have the host language also. And I think it's, as Evelyn said, if you do have parents who are looking specifically at English, it's unearthing a little bit more of why. What is it that, why are they making this choice? What is it what's their considered thought on English? And it may be sharing with them more data, more research that actually would allow them to come to an understanding. And I think that's why workshops for parents coming into schools are so important, so that they have an understanding of, for example, why we'd use translanguaging in the first place? What are the benefits of it? Is it that it's seen as a positive thing, that it's seen as developing, all the different areas of learning that it does? So I think, it's about partnership and it's about transparency and open conversations with parents.
I think also that Eowyn Crisfield has described it really well. If you can explain to parents that you are creating an intellectual gap for your child, if you stop talking and expanding the dominant language, that is something that nobody wants for their child. So I think the more you educate the parents, and you do that by building trust and small training sessions maybe, but the fact that they need to understand that an intellectual gap is created when you do that. That's the moment, I think, where most of the shifts happen, both for when you do the teacher training and when you talk to the parents. But on the other hand, there are moments where it's their choice. I think it is important to identify that it is connected to the culture and it is connecting to more than just a language.
And maybe also that it's not going to make their English worse. Like if that's their fear, that they won't develop English as well if they're still allowed to speak, where in actual fact that's a huge misconception.
I think that also brings in that I can't help but think about code switching when we're talking about this. Like, so oftentimes code switching was seen as, well, they haven't fully developed their language well enough, so they can't speak it well, otherwise, but really it shows mastery, because if I know how to say it better than this language and I can get my meaning off better by switching to this word in Spanish perhaps, which happens to me all the time, instead of saying in English, then that shows I understand both languages quite well, because I know that I can't get my message across in this language, but I can in this language, and it's about communication, right? And if I know you speak that language and I want to say it in that language, then why wouldn't I, right? Because it makes sense. So it's also like demonstrating that language mastery looks different than what we think it does. It doesn't mean that you have to stay in one language the whole time. You might switch languages depending on who your audience is, and that's okay.
Yeah, and it is not creating, bilingualism is not two languages exactly at the same level. It isn't monolingual in one and monolingual in another. Bilingualism doesn't work that way. And so it is very much, you will always be tapping into any of the languages, because sometimes, the word just doesn't exist in that other language. So you want to use the language in another one. So.
And some just have a better way of describing exactly what you want to say.
Yes. Or a more fun way, absolutely. So we've talked about kind of what it looked like 20 years ago and how thinking has really evolved in the last 20 years. What's next for translanguaging?
For me, it really needs to spread wider. Having experienced so many different schools around the world, the country where I am right now, I really believe that shift hasn't happened there yet. And so I think that it is all happening in some of the international schools that we are working in, and that slowly needs to just spread further and further, because it is the right way to go, and it is the way I think we validate the cultures and the different languages. So I believe that the future is really about spreading it more and more, and not isolating it maybe as much to some of the great international schools that we have, but really that it becomes a logical choice for anybody in any country.
And I think probably as well, maybe more evident across different disciplines, so that it's not necessarily in a language classroom or in a classroom of young students, but when they move on to science or math or different disciplines, that these opportunities are there as well. Because again, going back to your previous question, how do you develop the academic language and the home language? Translanguaging is one of these vehicles to do that in such a way.
And all teachers are language teachers, and so what does that look like right through? Yeah.
I think it also starts, our subscriptions should grow to include more language resources, right? Like our library should develop to be more inclusive and having more options for students, just the digital access, the tools that they use, and perhaps giving them that right to attempt something in another language and then use the Google tools to translate. I mean, I think just the way we think about the ongoing formative assessment, but the summative assessment task, where their language can manifest, as long as we're checking understandings, right? Is that, you know, I mean, if I'm not assessing actually the writing in English, but I'm only looking for the science, exactly what language does it matter, especially now that I can scan something with my phone and translate it, right? So I think it's also us getting a shift in our mind of what all of this looks like, and challenging ourselves to take it to another level.
And you were talking earlier today, Juliette, about the tools teachers are using just to use that instant translation of recording their voice, translating it and giving it back to students.
I mean, 20 years ago it was very different, wasn't it? I mean, you were basically saying to a parent, you need to buy a dictionary, and that was on the table. Nowadays the technology is just stunning, and it allows for far better communication. And okay, sometimes the translation isn't great, but the message is there, and it's only going to get better. So in that sense, translanguaging, who knows, I mean, what the future will bring, but I can see the more the technology advances, the better it is to create that understanding and the communication between people, no matter what language they speak. And isn't that a great future then? That's hopefully creating a lot more understanding for each other and where we come from and what we're thinking. And I think that's the way forward for the rest of the world as well.
And just I think, linking to what you're saying there, wouldn't it be wonderful for us to be using mentor texts that students bring from their home country, so we can really look at, see what translating would give to us in English, but also then looking at the pictures, the images, what it's telling us about the different cultures, getting cultural understanding, being able to use, more diversity.
Well, and I think that brings two things. It doesn't only bring the language, it also brings new case studies. Because I've often reflected as a teacher when I study human rights, for example, I look at the case studies that I have traditionally used, and frankly there weren't any from Asian countries. And then I had to kind of step back and go, I feel like I've got a global spread here, but it's not truly representative of most countries. So mentor text also gives that kind of identity and new rich case studies. They don't have to be a direct translation of a text that we have in English. They can be an opportunity for new case studies that we wouldn't maybe otherwise have access to.
Yeah, and that sense of belonging.
Something we've been talking a lot about lately, like unpacking what does global mean. We got local, but global. Does global mean just I found it in one example in one country, or like how many examples can I find across the span of the globe? Like it's global, right? Like local and global context. That's massive, you know. So definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me. It's kind of an interesting space to watch. I think there's lots of exciting opportunities, and technology will continue to bring more opportunities, and as educators we have to keep up with that and really embrace all that's available. Thank you so much.